I think very quickly to make a reference to the Ubuntu Diplomacy document. Essentially, I think I'm not going to rehash what Ubuntu means in detail, simply to say that according to the white paper, Ubuntu is considered to be an acknowledgement of our interdependence as human beings, our interconnectedness, and South Africa's agenda is aligned to this philosophical outlook. So it champions, or intended to champion, values of human rights, democracy, reconciliation, the eradication of poverty and underdevelopment, not only in South Africa but across the world, and Africa in particular. And this philosophy of international relations, it seeks to also promote, in a sense, to how when nations interact with each other. So we can question the extent to which, first of all, these values are manifesting themselves within South Africa, and the extent to which South Africa has succeeded in supporting and upholding these values in the rest of Africa. And I think some of the items that our colleagues will speak about will raise interesting issues around this broad philosophical framework. There is the question of SA's agenda in Africa, but there's also perhaps something to be said about what South Africa can learn from the rest of Africa. We are still feeling the aftershocks of the securitization of parliament, the militarization of politics, and Africa unfortunately has a number of recommendations to make and suggestions of how not to go down that road. So perhaps that's something we might want to pick up in the Q&A session. But to help us unpack some of the elements of SA's agenda in Africa, we are going to have each speaker speaking for 5 minutes about their regions and the issues that have come up. And then we shall have an open Q&A. And I know some of you need to leave in about an hour, so kindly complete your M&E forms before you leave. That is very helpful for us. And also, if you've driven here, you can get your parking validated so that you don't have to pay for it on the way out. So, with those few remarks from me, I'm going to ask Fidi to proceed with her 5-minute statement. And I have a timer here with me, which will in fact allow us to make sure we stick to 5 minutes. And at the end of the 5 minutes, you should hear this sound.
Sure,
There you go. So, Fidi, you have the floor.
Thanks, Tim. Not a statement, just a few thoughts from me. And I'm afraid I will start with a fairly cynical interpretation of where things are. And I do this because I know that Webster is the eternal optimist and idealist, and he will pick up from where I leave off. So, if we're going to start with the concept of Ubuntu, which is what this white paper is titled, Building a Better World, the Diplomacy of Ubuntu, and Tim has started with the nicely sounding title of this conversation, Rhetoric or Reality. My immediate interpretation would unfortunately be rhetoric, and much ado about nothing. If indeed Ubuntu is, as defined in this paper, our affirmation of humanity through the affirmation of the humanity of others, and there's also reference on more than one occasion to Batho Pele, the Sotho principle, which Nelson Mandela initiated as part of his term, which is putting people first. I think we need to look a little bit deeper into what that means in our society, both in South Africa and also how that rhetoric is resonating and bringing in the international corridors. So if, for instance, we look at xenophobia in South Africa, which certainly is a huge violation of the humanity of fellow Somalis and many other foreigners in our country, and the fact that the SONA didn't make any meaningful reference to it, and indeed I think it would have been an opportunity to have made an apology to foreigners who are seeking refuge in our country, then I think that is the first occasion on which we're not doing too well. Secondly, gender-based violence, again something that was given incredibly scant reference in the State of the Nation address. gender-based violence unfortunately makes the headlines globally. It is something that I face in the field all the time. People ask me, what is wrong with your country? Why are you raping old women? Why are you raping babies? Again, something that I think is an indictment on how we perceive our humanity in this country. And the fact that the SONA addressed it so legally is unfortunately also very disappointing. Somebody did a word count on how often the word poverty was mentioned in the State of the Nation, and that too was very, very low. And then last, of course, not least, and not specifically related to SONA, but rather to the after-SONA moments, the reference by Baleka Mbete to Julius as a cockroach, which for me, aside from many other things, is really just so disrespectful to Rwandans, and such a disrespect of the Rwandan experience in the international arena. I work specifically on Uganda and on South Sudan, and so obviously I look at South Africa's foreign policy through what South Africa has or has not achieved in these two countries. And in Uganda, I think perhaps the most striking incident for me has been our legacy, so to speak, in not speaking out about the law against homosexuality. The Human Rights Commission last year made a call to President Zuma to condemn the law, and the response was, we respect the country's sovereignty. Finished. And I'll let you interpret what that means, but I think an opportunity for South Africa to really make a striking response and to have stood up for something that, in fact, we have actually played a lead on internationally. In 2010, I think it was, when we commissioned and sponsored a very major report at the United Nations to investigate the living conditions of LGBTI communities around the world. And a few years later, we're saying, no, sorry, that's your business, not ours. So I think they're a missed opportunity, definitely. South Sudan, I think, is an interesting case. Last year in the State of the Nation, President Zuma appointed Cyril Ramaphosa as his special envoy for South Sudan and Sri Lanka. Since then, as far as I know, Cyril has been to Juba once. That was before he was appointed as president. Subsequently, he traveled to Arusha at the beginning of this year to be part of the dialogue between intra-SPLM dialogue on South Sudan. I do also think, unfortunately, that Cyril Ramaphosa's appointment as a special envoy in South Sudan is a controversial one. Even though he sort of undid some of his economic interests as part of Shanduka when he became president last year, those stakes remain in his family, and Shanduka has major economic interests in South Sudan. He has various director and non-executive directorships in MTN, in Standard Bank, in the Bubenzer group, in various mining houses, some of which are involved in South Sudan. And so I'm afraid I am a little bit cynical as to his neutrality in the situation. So before I will wrap up just with the final comment that I think if you ask any people in South Sudan, on the streets of Kampala, Juba, possibly Nairobi, as to whether South Africa's foreign policy is one of Ubuntu,
Thank you, Fidi. Provocative ending to your intervention. We move over to Webster.
Thank you. Good afternoon. When Fidi says I'm an idealist, I think I'm beginning to doubt myself even when I look at events taking place here. I recall 10 years ago, I visited the University of KwaZulu-Natal for a workshop, and there was a guy from Burundi. He brought a lamp, a solar lamp, and he was checking where to put it, and he says, no, I'm bringing this because electricity may go out. And I asked, who told you that? He said, I never know. I said, this is South Africa, my friend. Electricity does not go out here. I wonder if he still remembers that, because I think the reality team is now actually coming, that we are a normal African country. And the issue around Ubuntu Diplomacy, having two tenets, Pan-Africanism and South-South solidarity. Not South-South cooperation is later in the details, but at first it's South-South solidarity. I think it's also looks at how solidarity, which is something I'm going to speak to more now because I only have 5 minutes. How solidarity is one that is leading us to blind solidarity. What do I mean by blind solidarity? This blind solidarity is to the liberation movements. it is quite ironic that the oldest liberation movement, ANC, from which most of these liberation movements were cloned from, including ZANU-PF, the first political party we had in Zimbabwe was Southern Rhodesia, ANC, so was in Zambia and all that. It got independent so late. Actually, it was the last to become free, which was probably a blessing in disguise, because when South Africa became independent, even those African countries who had become independent earlier were still looking to their mother clone to provide guidance and leadership. And I think in Mandela we saw that leadership, but he soon realized that Africa was a different terrain altogether. A clear example was in the 1995 execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa in Nigeria. And Mandela goes there and said he was recommending that South Africa be booted out of the Commonwealth. And Africa literally gangs up against Mandela. That's what we are trying to say. This is not politics. Here is hard politics. And that is where I think when we see Mbeki entering the frame, we saw a shift from a South Africa which was going to be the torchbearer to a South Africa which started speaking the language of we do not want to be an hegemonic state. And the clearest example during Mbeki's time then around Ubuntu Diplomacy was how blind solidarity saved Mugabe and ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe, where most of my work is based. Not only did he hide the Campepe report which he had commissioned, but in 2007, 2008, during the first tenure of South Africa in the United Nations Security Council, they actually forced Zimbabwe to be removed from the agenda of the Security Council. Come 2008, Mugabe loses an election and Mbeki goes on to form a government of national unity to save the mighty who had fallen. Of course, the reality is always that Mugabe had to fall at some time later. But what I'm looking at here is a situation where we have blind solidarity in trying to save each other rather than progressing with the burden, I call it the burden of the South African Constitution, which the ANC is failing to live up to. It has been a burden because it is such a progressive constitution which, if we had to use it constitutional, we would be somewhere not only in South Africa, but as a continent. And the second issue around blind solidarity that ANC government is learning from other African countries is the conflicting of party and state roles to undermine democratic principles. And this is not starting in the current government. It started actually with the Mbeki regime, using state institutions to deal with party issues. Jacob Zuma enters the fray and does it more badly, but it's not something that started now. If you look at how Mbeki even tried to stay at the helm of the ANC, that showed how he was looking at the party as more supreme than than government. And yet he wanted actually to continue running the government to the house, which is where most of the challenges we are having here were seated, because Zuma now has to deal with undoing the bed that was there, but he's undoing it in a worst case. And the worst case scenario is when we saw the White Army entering Parliament on Thursday. Of course, thank you, Tim.
Carry on.
The worst perhaps was the jamming of the communication system. We are used to that in Africa, north of the Limpopo, where democracy is missing, presumed dead. When Gaddafi was coming through Africa in 2002 or so, he would jam every kilometer around him. It was normal when you had this. So these are things that we are surprised that it can happen during the State of the Nation address in South Africa of all the countries. That is probably where Ubuntu Diplomacy has copied the wrong things. Let me just end out by what Carlton said. He says, in a democracy, in a dictatorship, people don't trust what their governments say, even if sometimes it may be true. In a democracy, people trust their governments, even if what they say may actually be wrong. I think we are moving towards where our trust is thinning in South Africa, not only for this country, but for the region and the continent as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Webster. Very important point on blind solidarity. What would be useful is to also think about what are the causes of this blind solidarity. I'm linking it to a sense of siege from the international community, or a sense of prosecution or victimhood, or a combination of all of those three. We're moving on now to Patrick, our next speaker, Great Lakes region.
Thank you. One of the important points in this Ubuntu diplomacy is, as Dr. Tim mentioned, the interdependence that we have, not only as African, but also as the world, because now we can analyze our lives in the light of what is going on, as if we share all the problems. Because in the context of globalization, the world is coming as one village. So coming back to this point of interdependence, I just want to mention that at a given moment, South Africa has played a key role, especially in the Great Lakes region, and especially for my country, which is Burundi. Since 1999, there was ongoing civil war in Burundi, and in order to bring an end to this conflict, Nelson Mandela played a key role as a peace broker. He was the only figure who has this strength and knowledge, and who managed to gain the respect of all the fighting groups, and managed to bring all of them to the negotiating table. So in 2000, in August 2000, a peace truce was signed, and from that time, despite some problems which were related to the armed groups which did not want to lay down weapons. But we saw a change in the way the situation, or the security situation, was in Burundi. And in 2003, the main armed group attempted to enter the government. And from that time, a tremendous change was noticed. And that's when we started seeing some kind of stability within the country. So here I want to link this issue of stability for Burundi with the whole region of the Great Lakes. Because today, if you analyze the main country, meaning Burundi, Rwanda, and DRC, the instability in one country has some direct consequences in other countries. And if you remember in the address of the State of the Nation address that with the president, he mentioned that South Africa currently is expecting around 30% of the energy which is going to be produced from Congo. So the question is, if this region is facing instability and war is still going on, especially in Congo, will this be possible in a context when South Africa is facing this huge problem of energy? So you see how we are interconnected. If in this area, in Burundi, in DRC, and in Rwanda, there will be instability, those who are building the big Inga Falls, will they be able to finish the work? And if it is not finished, how this situation will influence this problem of energy in South Africa. So here it's where I want for you to reflect on how we are connected to each other and how our dependence is really an issue that we have to take into account, so that maybe if it is possible for South Africa to review this move that was being observed in the past when the South African government was involved in resolving conflict, and when we saw some successes. So there is a need to encourage maybe the government to go on with this policy, taking into account this issue of how we are depending on each other, so that we can see if the problems which are resolved in Burundi, in Rwanda, in DRC, can be a starting point to resolving the problems in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And just to mention that the relationship South Africa has with the Great Lakes region is quite profound. In a sense, Burundi and DRC, South Africa is currently implicated in the United Nations MONUSCO mandated force intervention brigade in the eastern DRC, which is attempting to quell armed militias in that region. And it has, as I mentioned last week, limited success on that front. The Burundi link has been described adequately. The president of Burundi was here recently, and a high-level communique between the two presidents was issued. And so there's a very strong framework of engagement there. With Rwanda, perhaps less so, but we can work towards improving those relations in the future. I should also mention that the work we've done in the Great Lakes has been linked quite strongly to the South African Department of International Relations and Cooperation in Pretoria, and the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development also in Pretoria, who have referred to us colleagues from Burundi to assist with technical support, justice and reconciliation issues. With that, we move to our final, by no means least important, Kelly Jo Bluen, International Justice.
Thank you. So I wanted to, when Tim gave us this sort of expansive topic to cover, I wanted to think a little bit about the way in which South African foreign policy is construed. And one of the things that kind of comes up very often, whether it's in the media or whether it's when you talk to different people, is this idea of a kind of haphazard foreign policy, an unpredictable foreign policy, and a kind of an idea around a Mandela nostalgia, as it were. You know, South Africa's lost its way, lost its values. One of the things that analysis for me lacks is an understanding of the multiplicity of values that are encompassed in the way in which, thank you. So serious.
It's a danger of using your phone.
You know, there are many different values, and if you look at, so I think there's a couple of things. First of all, I think there are many different values, there are many different drivers, there are many different audiences, and there are many different institutional dynamics at play in the way in which South Africa makes its decisions. So if you look at the Ubuntu foreign policy, and I think the idea of using Ubuntu as a driving force for foreign policy is immensely ambitious. And there's a lot of contestation around what it might mean. But what is interesting about it is that it's not devoid of a national interest, right? And in the introduction to the policy, the word national interest comes up about 7 or 8 times, if I'm not mistaken. And the whole idea is that South Africa's national interest is framed in the context, within a normative context, of the national interest and interdependency of others. So I think that kind of putting it all down to a lost Mandela nostalgia is inaccurate. There's a key component of national interest. There's a lot of driving forces, right? There is Pan-Africanism as a key component. South-South solidarity, sometimes blending, as a key component. There is also a strong commitment to engaging with northern partners. There is a strong commitment to human rights in a very uncontested kind of international human rights framework sense of it. And there is a strong commitment to internationalism, and I guess a very strong decolonial essence. I quite liked what Superman Lazondi of the Institute for Global Dialogue said. He wrote, Ubuntu is proposed as an idea through which South Africa envisages a new world and a new world system. So I think you have to understand, and for me, looking at this policy, Ubuntu needs to kind of be disaggregated beyond something that sounds normatively appealing to the various components of what this might mean. And I think then it appears a lot less haphazard when you look at South Africa's policy decisions and rhetoric through this lens. So I'm just going to pick up on, because I'm sure we don't have time for a lot, and thankfully the SONA was pretty shallow on foreign policy. But I did want to pick up on the one point that President Zuma made, which had to do with the celebration of the 70th anniversary of the United Nations and the need for reform of the Security Council. And now for me, and I'm just going to speak about it in rudimentary terms, we can take it up more in Q&A, but one of the things that comes out clearly is, number one, a solid commitment to an international human rights framework, right? It's fundamentally status quo. It's saying we believe in the system, we have respect for the system, we want to cooperate with the system. But there's also a decolonial narrative that comes up too, right? We don't believe in the way the system exists as it is now. And I think, again, if you come back to the context of both different drivers, but also different audiences, right? Who is that for? It's in part a statement to a slightly nervous West, respect ambassador, around, this is a clear respect for the system, but also an upfronting of the fact that a system that is premised on 1945 geopolitical arrangements is not functional for the kind of Ubuntu diplomacy that South Africa might want to, push forward. And I think, reflecting on some of my work, so I cover a lot of the arrangements around South Africa and the African Union and the International Criminal Court. And one of the things that you see, it's patent, this kind of dichotomy, these various competing interests that come out when you look at this relationship. Because on the one hand, South Africa is deeply critical of the court. And that's very much, I think, if you look at the discrepancy between South Africa's statements at an African Union level as compared to at a kind of ICC level, it's clear that there's different audiences because South Africa is deeply critical. When you speak to anyone at DIRCO, the first thing that they'll tell you is how deeply, critically they take responsibility under international law. So I think, again, there's this multiple audiences that comes out. And if you look at it, it's not just rhetorical. In practice, first of all, if you look at this is constitutional court, so it's not DIRCO per se, but in October last year, the Constitutional Court handed down a landmark judgment on the Zimbabwe torture case. And critical to the court's reasoning there was South Africa's obligations under international criminal law. I think if you see IJR was present at the Assembly of States parties to the Rome Statute in New York at the end of last year. And one of the things, His Excellency Michael Masuta gave the address for South Africa, Minister of Justice. He didn't once mention the fact that the charges against William Ruto of Kenya remained. He didn't mention anything about the Kenyan cases. The whole premise of his speech was around the importance of domestication of the crime of aggression. So I think, and I'm going to beat my time, this is outrageous, right? So I think that when, sorry? So I think then that it's important when looking at this, there's a strong decolonial element, there's a strong need to be friends with the West, there's a strong Pan-African agenda, there's a strong sense of solidarity. And unless we kind of comprehend the multiplicity of audiences, of interests, of values, I'm afraid our analysis of South African foreign policy can only be shallow.
Thank you, Kelly Jo. Very quickly, picking up on the South Africa's relationship with the ICC, it is a kind of a schizophrenic relationship. It's confused to a certain extent because on the one hand, yes, South Africa wants to uphold its international treaty obligations. On the other hand, South Africa is a dominant player at the African Union, which has a stated beef, if you will, with the ICC. Notably because Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma is the chairperson of the African Union Commission in Addis Ababa. And recently, South Africa has increased its budget to the AU I believe from $10 million to $60 million. That's quite a sizable chunk of cash, indicating where it sees its agenda line. And so in the Sona speech, you also saw two references to the AU. The first being that the African Union anthem should be and will be sung in schools in South Africa, alongside the South African national anthem. And secondly, that is to inculcate a sense of Pan-Africanism among South Africans. We discussed that last week. And secondly, the African capacity for immediate response to crisis, as CIRC, is also featured in the speech as being operationalized and now ready to go. And if you think about South Africa's adventures in the Central African Republic, in the DRC, this is a framework that South Africa very much hopes to utilize in the future. And more directly linked to our work, the African Union is on the cusp of launching a African Union transitional justice policy framework. And it's good to see our colleague Sophia from the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, who have been driving that process. And going forward, we're looking forward to partnering on how we can, in fact, leverage this policy framework much more effectively, not only in South Africa, but across countries across the continent on these issues of justice and reconciliation. And the next summit of the African Union will be held in South Africa, either in Johannesburg or Durban, depending on how the policymakers feel. They might feel a little bit of a break by the beach, they might go to Durban. And so that's a huge opportunity for organizations based in South Africa to also engage with key decision makers within the African Union framework, since they will be here in South Africa. So I think we've covered quite a number of bases. I don't want to belabor the issue of various themes that have been raised. I'm going to open it directly to the floor. Kindly state your name and affiliation, and let us know what you would like to contribute to the discussions.